reasons?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it was. It's for the obvious reason that I just thought it's a good emergency drug that I could self-administer because I'm probably going to be eating strange things or running into trouble. So it was for that reason. But I put down 3 other notes because it was basically, it's quite topical because there's a new Resus UK vaccination program guidelines, which adrenaline's obviously the start. So that's kind of a new thing out there because of all the vaccinating we're doing. I just couldn't believe how good the history is of finding adrenaline because it's this whole thing about a Japanese chemist in America who kind of discovers it and patents it in 1901. But then you've got the first ever professor of pharmacology also thinks he's discovered it. And so one's calling it adrenaline and the other one's calling it epinephrine, and we still can't agree the name between here and the States. So I just think that's fantastic, that story. And then the bit that I thought you would like is that the fact it's in 3 chapters of the BNF, adrenaline. So that's chapters 2, 3, and 7. And I thought you'd love that. And then the final bit, actually, the honest, truthful bit, which is the emotional bit for me, is I think it just takes me back to the stories you probably know in the press a couple of years ago of Natasha, the 15-year-old that died from anaphylaxis on the flight from London to Nice with her father and her friend because she had the allergic reaction to the baguette from Pret a Manger. And I think it's just, to me, this adrenaline is just something that I think we should have out there more accessible for people in terms of these acute crises with anaphylaxis. And the coroner's stuff from that is fascinating. It's just like, even though they had an EpiPen or 2 on the plane, it's just, is the needle size right? Is the dose in the injection right? So there's just so much about adrenaline. I just think it's a really important drug that needs to be built up more.
Okay, great. We'll certainly accept that as a desert island drug. Thank you for that. And what about a soundtrack there on anthem to your career or life, if you like?
So this is taking me back to being an Englishman in Wales, because obviously I was in Cardiff in the 80s. And I think for me, you'll find where this is going, but it's a bit about U2 and B.B. King. And the track is When Love Comes to Town, which is on their album Rattle and Hum.
Okay, yeah, remember that.
Yeah, and it is just brilliant. But U2 were kind of around in the 80s, and I wouldn't say I was necessarily a big fan, but of course Bono, they were quite influential in Band Aid, and that was a big emotional thing, and continues to be so, I think. So U2 were important, and then at the end of the 80s, I think they did this tour around America with Rattle and Hum, and it seems that the album, I think, was successful, but I think they made a documentary film which was a flop. And it was allegedly because I think the critics said they couldn't understand why this rock and roll band had a fascination with American soul, blues, and other music styles. And to me, the perfect thing about that particular track is it just blends rock and roll with electric blues. And much like my partners at work, I wouldn't necessarily spend all day listening to them, and I wouldn't necessarily spend all day listening to you too. And much like having you, Steve, as a clinical pharmacist, I wouldn't want to listen to you all day, and I wouldn't want to listen to B.B. King all day. But when you put the two together, it's just fantastic. It's that synergy and energy you get from that combination of 2 different styles.
Right. Well, that's a great answer. We'll definitely take When Love Comes to Town, U2 and B.B. King, into the Aural Apothecary Spotify playlist. Excellent. And the final question, of course, is would you like to recommend a book to our listeners that might be of use for them in their healthcare careers?
It's not an option.
Okay. I mean, I was going to say if I was just going for a week and it was a holiday, I just wanted to take Robert Harris Imperium because I love that book.
Oh, that's a great book. I've read that.
Yeah, I love that book, but I think it has to be the book that I really, really love, which is How to Implement Evidence-Based Healthcare by Tricia Greenhalgh.
Ah,
a classic.
She's a legend, isn't she?
Yeah, I mean, she's around a lot. I can't say I follow her, but she'll occasionally pop up on one of the TV news. She's a big Twitterer, and I don't necessarily follow it all. And she does a lot of important stuff from Oxford there around primary care, and all through this COVID thing, she's done some quite good information updates. I mean, to very quickly, I mean, I'd like to, because she's done some quite neat little articles in the BJGP, and then she's kind of reviewed stuff around mind lines and other stuff. So I think she resonates quite well in my education role and implementing and trying to improve healthcare to our patients. So that's why I like a book that kind of puts it all into chapters. So you've got a finite framework to think, how do I implement good healthcare?
I think the 3 apothecaries would definitely agree with that, and a really good book for people certainly starting out. And also a reminder to all of us that evidence moves on and we have to keep up to date.
Very good. Very good. Thanks for those insights, Lawrence. Let's move on to our micro discussion next. So, just published in the British Journal of General Practice in February of this year. For those listening to the archive, the year is 2021. It asks the question, what role is there for nudging clinicians? And I'm going to hand straight back to Lawrence. He's going to earn his keep tonight. What do you think, Lawrence? Do you want to start by explaining some of the background to nudging and where it's come from?
Yeah, I love this stuff. I really love this stuff. So
you're in good company.
Nudging is, my understanding is Richard Thaler is a professor from Chicago who I think is a bit cheeky, a bit mischievous, but obviously super bright. And I remember, I think he was interviewed on Today programs, in the morning back in 2015 when behavioural insights was the trendy thing with the government. And I just was fascinated. He just was great. He said, I've got a messy desk at work, I can't find anything, and I bonded with him then. And then if you look at BBC Sounds app, there's that podcast with Tim Harford interviews him. And just to get my nudge excitement out the way, I just love the bit about this Richard Thaler's dinner party. So you go there, he gives you a huge bowl of cashew nuts, and everybody's loving the cashew nuts and saying this is fantastic.
You're going to link to adrenaline here, aren't you?
No, I'm not. There's no anaphylactic nut reaction, I promise you. But the story is he's watching this and he thinks, well, that's not right, because if they all eat all these cashew nuts, they're not going to want the dinner I've cooked them. So he takes it away. And then the guests will say, thank goodness he took it away as well. They love him for that as well. Now, he then looks at this and thinks this is behavioural economics, and this is really important, that you can't have this in classical economics, but this is behavioural economics. And he writes it up. I just think this is brilliant. But this paper, I think, is really the difference between nudge, which is behavioural economics, and the psychologist, which is the Daniel Kahneman stuff. And I think they're quite different, and I think we can apply similarities in healthcare.
Let me just come back to that then, and just a quick story. Several years ago, I read a paper. This is a tip for everybody listening. Okay, I read a paper, and it was on the theory of planned behaviour. Okay, a psychological model. And why don't GPs follow antibiotic guidelines and asthma guidelines? And I've been in the influencing, prescribing practice for several years, and it's the first time that I'd come across this paper, and I thought, well, how come I haven't seen this before? Anyway, so I rang the author. I went absolutely direct. I rang the author. And so I would recommend that if you read somebody's work and you like it, ring them, let them know. I rang the author, and it was a health psychologist in Oxford. And I said, I love this. I said, I really enjoyed reading this. And she said, she says, I'm moving to Cardiff in 3 months' time. So she moved to Cardiff. We met for a coffee, and I started teaching on the health psychology course in Cardiff Metropolitan. So then we started introducing the subject of prescribing and medicines to the health psychology students. My advice and tip really is, if we haven't got health psychologists near our agenda, and for the medicines optimization teams listening to this, if you haven't engaged with your local health psychologist, then it is a complete missing part of the jigsaw. Don't throw more pharmacists or more GPs at this, the influencing problem. They are a key figure here.
Yeah. And I love this sort of stuff. When you read into it, and if you look at, the book, one of the books they recommend is Thinking Fast and Slow by Kahneman and his colleagues. And that's possibly one of my books I'd take to the desert island. But what they talk about is why we make wrong decisions. We used to have this argument years ago, didn't we, Jamie, when we were talking to doctors about why it's not a good idea to have too much influence of the drug industry over your prescribing, and the answer would always be the same. Well, it doesn't affect me, and the answer is it does, because they understood nudge and health psychology 10-20 years before we did. But I was going to say, one of the big examples that I wanted to mention was what happened here in Wales with organ donation was perhaps an example of maybe not nudge but behavioural, well, it probably was nudge, but behavioural psychology, when they changed the default from instead of asking people to say, do you want to be on the register, they said to people, do you want to go off the register? And so that's an example of introducing a friction cost, they call it, into the decision. And as a result, overnight, the numbers of people on the organ donor register went up, 80%, because most people did want to be on the register. It was just too much of a hassle to do it. And all you had to do was slightly change the choice architecture around it. Lo and behold, massive change overnight.
So all I would say is that the friction stuff, all the agenda seems to come from secondary care if you're a GP. So they seem to they're brilliant at creating friction in their choices for us. But I think it's much harder for GPs to have frictionless action the other way.
The thinking fast and slow, though, I've always said that thinking is actually very underrated in the NHS. And I think pharmacists are well suited to the idea of the slow thinking too, isn't it? The idea, because we are naturally anally retentive, and I use that phrase a lot. But Lawrence knows, and I mean it, but that's the whole idea of System 1 and System 2, isn't it? So System 2 requires you to just sort of stop, think, refocus on what you're doing. And it's very, very hard. In primary care, I've noticed the volume of work I get through is huge in comparison perhaps to what I was doing in secondary care. So I have to stop and think even more, and I am, anally retentive. So, and the other thing I would say about the example of Paul was just saying about the transplant card is that think about plastic bags. Okay, so it only took 5p a plastic bag to get the UK to decide that it reduced the number of plastic bags it used and bought by 90% in 4 years. Literally by only having to charge you 5p for a plastic bag. Imagine if we made something around prescription charges so that people, because they don't value anything that's free. Imagine if you just made a very small nudge that said, if you're going to have to pay a very small amount, well, I won't bother, thanks, because I don't take that medicine.
Point of order, that's not a nudge.
Okay, what is that?
Because you've introduced an economic penalty in, classically it's not a nudge. So it's part of behavioural science.
Okay, happy to be corrected.
Yeah, I thought, well, not corrected, but I thought I would mention that.
Okay, well, the table in that particular reference is excellent, isn't it? For every listener, go and have a look at all the different types of nudges that are pure.
Yeah, pure is a good word, because that's what the paper talks about, is the ethical considerations of when people know that they are being manipulated, then they dig their heels in, don't they? And so it comes on to the motivational interviewing. It's got to be done for the right purpose, with the right intent.
Very simply, from me as a GP, you've got behavioural economics, and I think there's this thing called mind lines, which is the real world. And I think then you've got classic economics, and that's guidelines in terms of healthcare. They're quite, they're interconnected, but there is the work out there in healthcare, but it just doesn't get the priority about implementation that it should. And my only other edgy bit, to be edgy, is the System 1 and System 2 stuff. I think we get bogged down in our education around System 2 stuff because it's stuff people struggle with and they want to talk it through and understand it. But none of us really talk to each other about our System 1 thinking. And I just think if we could have a education session around what everybody's doing in their System 1 thinking, and if we shared that, and then you can put it on computer templates, whatever you want to do, I think it would be massive. But I think we ignore System 1 processes for teaching.
And I think we see that now, don't we? With I've been seeing it in the play out with some of the messages around vaccination and the sort of traditional approaches. If we give people more facts, then they'll do the right thing. Whereas behaviour and economics says we have to think about, well, what's the behaviour that's led them to come to that opinion and try and work on that, as opposed to we just give them more information and then eventually they'll make the choice that we think is the right one.
An informed patient isn't an obedient patient. Okay, should we move on? Thank you for that, Lawrence. And we only don't even scratch the surface, obviously, in that, but it's an interesting paper. And I'm glad the paper's come out because I think it does introduce it to, as Steve said, if people take away the table, mind space and east from the behavioural insights team, then that's a step in the right direction.
A bit like Have I Got News for You editing, though. We should really say that we spoke for another hour about this after it was edited out by our producer.
And we'll continue the discussion on social media, I'm sure.
I'd just say, Jamie, I know you want to finish, but if people are interested in that, then that East framework that you mentioned, it's worth Googling that. Just Google East framework behavioural change, and it's well worth a read if you're interested in it.
As we're going all in, I mean, it does mention the behavioural change wheel as well by Susan Mitchie, who's Professor Susan Mitchie, who's been in the news a lot in the last 12 months advising the government. They seem to be ignoring it, unfortunately, but still. Okay. Gimmo, how can people get in touch with the Aural Apothecary?
Okay, so I think the main way is through Twitter, if you're on Twitter, so that's at Aural Apothecary. If you're on Instagram, we have got an account. It's at Aural Apothecary Pod. I won't lie, that's not where most of the activity is, but you can get in touch with us there and we'll post details of each episode up there. If you want to email us, it's at auralapothecarypod@gmail.com.
Okay, I hope you can join us next time when our special guest will be Lindsay Harper, Director of Pharmacy at the Salford Royal Care Organisation. Lindsay's an active member of the Greater Manchester Hospital Pharmacy Transformation Collaborative, where she leads on digital medicines and the automation workstream. We look forward to welcoming Lindsay to the Aural Apothecary. Once again, thank you very much to Lawrence for taking time out of a hectic schedule, I know, for joining us. Thank you to you, our audience, for taking the time as well. Over to Gimmo for the final ingredient.
So I know, Jamie, I know you're married to a doctor, I think. Steve, you're married to another pharmacist. I'm married to another pharmacist. This article in the BMJ talks about the perils of pillow talk with the other doctor in your life. But it does talk about other healthcare professionals as well. Being a doctor in a relationship with another doctor has its perks,